thank you all for coming. I'm Carol Losses. I'm Director of Education here at the English Speaking Union. It's not usually my job to introduce, but I welcome you all on behalf of the Executive Director, Christopher Broadwell, for this inaugural event. In many ways, it is our fall kickoff for the ESU of New York City branch. So welcome to our branch members. It is also our kickoff for our middle school debate program that we run in about 25 schools all around New York City. And we started with a workshop just prior to this for new teachers and new coaches in our league to tell them how to work with them on how to set up a new program. So we welcome all of our teachers and coaches in the audience as well for the beginning of our middle school debate season. And it is the inaugural debate for our ESU British debaters over here, who have just arrived in New York City. And we'll be debating, how many times do you think you'll be debating over the next 8 weeks, 6 weeks?
At least 21.
21, I think you're lowballing it.
Yeah.
So welcome to New York City and welcome to the United States. And good luck today to all of our debaters. For those of you who are new to the English Speaking Union, we welcome you here. We're part of a national network of their national headquarters. We have branches around the country in 60 communities. There are also ESUs around the world, and our British debaters are representing the ESU of the Commonwealth based in London. There are over 50 branches, 50 ESUs around the world. As Director of Education, I oversee a variety of programs that use the English language as a way of bringing people together through oral communications, from school children and their teachers. They work in programs on debate and Shakespeare. They attend professional development programs over in the UK, at Oxford, at Shakespeare's Globe, at the University of Edinburgh. And we also work with adult English language learners, new immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, temporary residents of the United States, to help them develop their English conversational skills and also to help new immigrants integrate into our culture, our economy, and become part of the United States community that we live in. And so we welcome all of these debaters as part of that mission of the United States debate, and part of the United States English Speaking Union mission, so thank you, to help us with our communication skills. I think there is no better or more important time in the United States history for us to be teaching these skills and modeling these skills of civil discourse. So thank you so much. I have to do a quick ad before I turn the podium over, and this podium's too tall for me. We have a program upcoming at Stratford-upon-Avon called From Page to Stage. It's in December. It's a little holiday tour in which you will have a behind-the-scenes look at Shakespeare's hometown in Stratford. Attend 4 plays, including A Christmas Carol, Twelfth Night, and Imperium, Part 1 and 2, and have some amazing opportunities to listen to some of the great lecturers on Shakespeare, see some of the Shakespeare treasures that Shakespeare's Birthplace Trust owns, and some really great behind-the-scenes moments that the ESU is able to use our connections to make happen. We encourage you to sign up today, and I know there's somebody in the audience who literally signed up today. Thank you. He needs more friends. But the deadline is...
Chris talked me into it.
Yes, it's quickly approaching. So if you're thinking about it, and it's an amazing price, I have to tell you. For $1,250, you get 4 plays, 5 nights accommodations, bed and breakfast, and your transfer from Heathrow Airport to Stratford-upon-Avon. I think it's a great deal, and we would love to see you here. Feel free to talk to me about it, and we have brochures all over the place. And that's the end of my advertisement. I'm going to turn the podium over to our partner in crime for tonight's evening, who's going to facilitate and get our debate started. I'm so grateful to Steve Lano from St. John's University, who I've gotten to know through middle school debate, but is very important in the field of university debate around the country and in New York City. And he's really helped make tonight happen, from setting our debate topic to telling you all what to do tonight, right?
That's right. My favorite part.
So I give the podium to you.
All right.
This podium might be too tall for me, too. When I teach speech at the university, I make it a point to take this podium and move it off to the side. And I just kind of make them speak like this, so I guess I should practice what I preach, or practice what I teach. See how clever I am. time or evening to come out. I am Steve Yano, I'm professor of rhetoric and debating at St. John's University, right next door in Queens. Just right down the road, not too far. By MTA time, I think it's about a 3-day journey. So, not too bad. But welcome tonight. I'm so glad you're here for our debate. Tonight, I'm going to introduce the debaters. I'm going to talk a little bit about the format that we've chosen to do tonight and what to look for. And all of you are sort of deputized as judges. So your criticism of the debate is incredibly valuable, not only for the debaters to hear what you thought of their performance, but also for yourselves. Because it's like Carol, I want to echo Carol's sentiment, that it's kind of nice to have a little respite where there's some like garden of civil discourse happening in a completely immersive, totalizing field of ideological shouting, which it seems like I don't think I'm alone in saying that it's a little, my ears are ringing. My rhetorical ears are ringing from this. It's nice for her to open up the ESU to us to have this event tonight. I really appreciate it. St. John's Debate's 10 years old. I started the program in 2007 when I came here to New York from Pittsburgh. And started the program as a way of practicing intellectual community for St. John's University students. But our mission has really sort of expanded from that to the community, to New York, as an attempt to try to get the quality of debate and public discourse up. And we have several students here who are part of the program, from people who've been in it a while to brand new people in the back who just joined this year. So it's really open to all the students, and this is the kind of program we like to do. So the debate you're going to see tonight is on the topic, this House believes that Brexit will be beneficial to the United States. We have a lot of speakers up here. So the format that we've chosen for tonight is British Parliamentary debate. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not, but the format is a format that comes out of the Oxford Student Union, and it has a, well, it's a controversial origin story. I'm sort of like convincing a co-author of mine to write sort of the history of this, but trying to figure out where it was formed. Everyone has their own story. It's kind of hard to get to the truth of it. But it's modeled after sort of a parliamentary system, or a game model of a parliamentary system. For Americans in the audience, most debate we think of is not in a parliamentary system, but a legal system. A winner-takes-all system, or zero-sum game, as we might call it, where there's a winner and a loser. There won't be such a judgment here tonight. We're not looking for a side victory, but more in the way you choose who to vote for in the next general election between two coalition governments. So that's the model to think about if you're familiar with parliamentary systems. So we have two teams in favor of the motion, the opening government, the closing government, two teams of two. I think they're over here. So this is the government bench, and then over here is the opposition, opening opposition and closing opposition, which is your opposition bench. Each partnership of two is trying to get your favor of being the team that did the best job advancing their case for their side. That's your charge. Who did the best job of advancing their case for their side, given what you know about the topic, given how persuasive they are, given what things they bring to bear, what analysis they bring to bear on the motion. And it's quite a fun format of debate, which I'll get to in a minute. But this is the kind of debate that they do at the World Championships. And all over the world, this kind of debate, this format of debate is done. So that's why I thought it would be good for tonight. Each speaker gets 7 minutes. You only hear from each one once. And the fun part is that very much like a parliamentary debate, points of information are allowed. So after the first minute, I'll have Lily demonstrate what this will look like, because she knows what she's doing. So after the, actually, do you guys want to keep time as well? Okay, great. I like deputizing my students at the last minute. That's good. So I might be giving a speech in favor of the debate, and let's say Lily's on the other side, and she doesn't really like what I'm saying, or she thinks it's bad, or she has a question for me. She will just sort of rise to try to ask a point, very much like this, and I can just acknowledge her by doing this and say, no, I don't want to take that. Or if I want to take it, I can say, yes, go ahead. She's about 20 seconds to either rebut what I'm saying, ask a question, clarify what I'm saying, offer some counterpoint, or something like that. The first and last minute of each speech are protected. No POIs are allowed, and our lovely timekeepers will clap to indicate to the debaters that they can ask questions, and that'll be permitted. So let me introduce the debaters. So we'll start with our guests, who came all the way from the UK yesterday, and I think they had a good time today exploring New York, our little town, wandering around. So on closing opposition, you'll hear from them last tonight. That should close the debate. Becky Howarth and Richard Hunter. And I want to say a couple of things about Becky, who was the president of the Birmingham Debating Society and studied economics and German. And she is collecting words that are pronounced differently in American English than they are in British English. So if you have any words to add to her list, feel free to order.
Like Birmingham and Birmingham.
Yeah.
Birmingham, right? Did I say Birmingham?
Yes,
or
you
Birmingham?
did.
That's terrible. I can't even remember where I am. That's like a rhetorician rule. Context is king. And it's in Birmingham, right? And Richard is from, what, did I use something else from? Richard Hunter is, he's from Northern Ireland and graduated from the University of St. Andrews. And he is going to plant, he's a big fan of the mountain goats. I hate to tell you the mountain goats are coming here in concert in November. I think November 11th. So, big fan of mountain goats, and he's very interested to see the United States and has a great debate background as well. And he studied, what did you study, Richard? I'm looking here.
Modern history.
Modern history. Very nice. So, if you want to talk about Northern Ireland, I'm sure he will be happy to give his perspective. So, welcome to both of them. It's so nice of you to take your time, support the SU, and support the CIDD of NCA. So, we really appreciate you being here.
It's our pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Of course, of course. And now, I'll introduce the St. John's students, who I know so incredibly well. I'll read it off their paper. So, let me step out of the way. In opening government, and I don't know what order they're going to speak in, so I'll just go down the list. This is Amber Hatcher. She's a junior English and government major from Chicago, Illinois. This is Anthony Romeo, who's a junior Homeland Security major, and he is from Long Island. Where is that? Just kidding. And then in closing government, they're the opening government. Is that right? Closing government, we have Michaela Torres, who's a senior rhetoric and government major, and she's from Los Angeles, the city of angels, California. And her partner is Hugh John Goborn, senior English and rhetoric major from the Big Bronx. See that long journey all the way here tonight. On the opposition side with our British friends, we have Maureen Sledge, who's right here. And she is a sophomore computer science major from Long Island as well. And Eves Wynn is her partner, who's a sophomore rhetoric journalism major, is that right? From Las Vegas, Nevada. So we have great diversity here tonight. I will turn the debate over to them to kick it off, and I hope you enjoy the debate, and afterwards we'll take Q&A.
Please move that.
Absolutely, we can move that. Yeah, after my own heart. That's great. You guys don't want to use this team.
It's too
Yeah. I'll move it to try not to break it. I'm sure it's like an antique or something. All right, that's much better. All right, let's start the debate, and then afterwards we'll have a Q&A, so I hope you enjoy it. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I'm an expert, right?
That's okay. Yeah.
In June of 2016, the United Kingdom held a referendum to reclaim their sovereignty and autonomy by voting to leave the European Union. Over the past year, we've seen countless debates about the impact this will have on the international community, Europe as a whole, and the United Kingdom itself. However, we think that the United Kingdom deciding to reclaim their sovereignty and autonomy in this way will have tremendous positive impacts on the United States. We think this for a variety of reasons, but mostly the greater European integration that will become as a result of this, the cooperation on global security and development that can now develop between the United States and the United Kingdom, and then lastly, bilateral financial decisions that we think will have positive outcomes for two nations that have very similar goals within the international arena. So firstly, we think that Brexit strengthens the European integration, and we think that this is something that the United States has supported and benefited from for more than 40 years. So why do we think this? Because we think that that's actually oftentimes a critique that you hear about Brexit, is that it will somehow divide up Europe and this will be a problem. But we think, given the current situation, we think that especially after the 2008 financial crisis, you saw a lot of Northern European members bailing out their Southern members, and you saw a not very cohesive European Union. You saw divisions on things like political and economic integration and the future of the European Union at risk. So what do we think happens now because of Brexit? Well, we think that a lot of the main actor that had so much cohesiveness towards a more unified European Union was the United Kingdom. So what do we think happens then after Brexit and like the United Kingdom getting the chance to leave? We think that now you have a more cohesive European Union, which can result in greater integration within the remaining European member states. And we think this is really key for United States interests. Why? Because we think that in the before Brexit, important issues to United States interests were going unresolved, such as migration, such as the sovereign debt crisis, and the European Union was not really able to solve these things in the manner that should have been able to. But now with Brexit, the European Union will be better able to handle these issues in a more cohesive way, in a way that will better favor United States of America interests, and we think that that's really key. We don't, at the point at which the United Kingdom does not want to continue on with the European Union, we think that taking them out will help to develop a more integrated European Union, more integration throughout Europe. We think the United States can benefit from Europe being more integrated, and we also think the United States can benefit from those issues being able to be solved within the European Union. Then secondarily, we think that the United States and independent UK can deepen cooperation on global security and development that is currently not possible with the United Kingdom in the European Union. So why do we think that? We saw during the Obama administration a partnership between USAID and the UK counterpart, the Department for International Development. And while that partnership was really great and really meaningful, we also saw some of the limitations of that partnership. Why is that? Because we saw a barrier that the European Union created for that partnership as the United Kingdom was delivering aid through European Union vehicles, and they weren't able to build a really strong United States, United Kingdom alliance for development for global security. And we think that what that did was it weakened the USA, the United Kingdom alliance. So we think that what happens now that you have Brexit is you get an expanded partnership between the United States and between the United Kingdom on development, on global security. And we think that those are two key interests for both of those nations. So we think that's incredibly important after this point. So we think that that's incredibly important. And you're going to see a larger impact on societies and also the international arena when you have these two nations cooperating on two areas of such importance. Yes?
Can you explain why the UK is so important in helping the US achieve its national security aims?
Because they both have very strategic interests, and I get into this more as well with financial regulations and sanctions, but at the point of which they both have very similar interests, we think that it's important that both of the nations work together for reasons of why bilateral political agreements are important. We think it's much better to have two nations working together rather than rogue nations working on their own. We think it's important that two economic, financial, global powers in that way work together and cooperate on issues of importance like national security, global cooperation for development of other nations. And then lastly, we think that bilateral cooperation is strengthened on financial issues like sanctions and financial regulations. So why is that? We think that in the current world, typically anything on negotiations, financial regulations, and economic sanctions on other nations has to currently be negotiated through the entire European Union partnership, and we think in that way it's much more difficult to get actions done. So why do we think this changes when with the result of Brexit, with the United Kingdom deciding to leave the European Union? We think that now you get a better, more streamlined process between the United States and between the United Kingdom. We think that rather than having infighting within the European Union about what to do on issues of financial regulations, what to do on issues of sanctions, we think that now you're actually able to get more decisions done and more actual action taken in those areas. We think that the United States and the United Kingdom, and this is more so in direct response to that POI as well, have shared interests like economically security. One of them, for example, is preventing things like currency manipulation that undermine both of their competitiveness in the global arena. We think that, therefore, a better, more streamlined process for financial cooperation is important to promote bilateralism within the international arena today. We think that it's really important that two of the world's leading financial centers, New York and London, are therefore able to create a better world through cooperating on financial mechanisms. We think that all of these things help to promote a world with better integration of Europe as a whole, and we don't think that they necessarily hurt the rest of Europe, but we also think that they help to facilitate a better relationship between two nations that have very similar interests. We think that European integration will be strengthened when you no longer have a nation that does not want to be a part of a membership being forced to be part of a membership. We think that the United States and independent UK can work together on measures where they share mutual interests like development, like global security, and we think that's incredibly important. And then lastly, we think that bilateral cooperation will be strengthened on issues like sanctions, on issues like financial regulations, and we don't think countries should have to wait for their sovereignty and autonomy, and we think that the United States can use the results of this vote in their favor, and we think that's incredibly important that the United States realizes the various positive impacts that Brexit can have for the United States as a whole. For all of these reasons, very proud to propose.
Okay, so we on Side Off believe that that Brexit will not be beneficial to the United States in three main ways. One is economically, two is power-wise, politically, and three is for our citizenship, for our citizens. Now I'm going to go in and rebut some of SciGov's throughout my speech. Okay, so it is bad for us economically because one, our imports and our exports are generally going, a large portion of them are going towards Britain, and due to Brexit, a lot of the, due to Brexit, the pound dropped in value, and due to that, the US dollar actually raised. Now, this is bad for us, because even though it might be cheaper to now go to England, it also makes it so that US-based international companies, such as Apple, such as Coca-Cola, will have less revenue gained from these international communities. Now, this will also lead to more companies letting go people within the United States, which will also raise our unemployment rate. And we can all agree a raised unemployment rate is bad for the United States. Now, also, there's the whole deal with interest rates. Now, before Brexit, our federal bank system decided that they were going to, said that they were going to raise interest rates. However, after Brexit, they said that that would be a reason not to raise interest rates. Now, interest rates not being raised causes an issue over time for us economically, due to the fact that with lower interest rates, it's basically saying that you shouldn't go and save your money. So as is, we aren't going to raise our interest rates eventually, and we haven't raised our interest rates in a good while due to the fact that interest rates are lowered so that more money is in circulation. However, once this stands for a long period of time, such as what is going to happen, and what is currently happening, it means more money is put into circulation, and that means less people are saving money in their banks, and that also means that with less money being put into banks, it's making it so that you don't gain money by putting in banks, causing less people to do it. Now, this is bad for us in the future, as my partner will go into. Now, there's also politically, Britain was one of our main allies in the EU, and a main channel that we went through for European agendas. Now, there's less support in the EU to negotiate trade and security deals. Now, SciGov says that, okay, that's okay, we can just go and we'll just deal with the UK. However, that also alienates us from the rest of the EU in that, not answering POS. Okay, so that's, it alienates us from all the other European nations in the EU, and it makes trade and alliances and treaties with them much harder by siding with the UK, by trying to make a situation which we are only with the UK, due to the fact that currently we really are only with the UK. We are our allies, though we have others, the UK is our strongest ally, and the fact that they left the European Union states that we lose out on them not being there. We lose out on a voice, a channel into the EU. Now, also, I said that this is bad for our citizenship, for the United States citizens themselves, because it legitimizes Trump, and it is and his conservative beliefs, it pushes them forward. Because if we think about why Britain left the EU, because they didn't want to welcome in refugees, immigrants, thank you. And we look at the toxic language that Trump uses to describe immigrants, it legitimizes that, and it gives power to more people like him in power. And that negatively affects immigrant groups within those nations. It causes feelings to be overwhelmed, to cause issues like that with Black Lives Matter, with like Muslims and all the negative backlash that they will receive. And they are a proud member, a proud citizen of these United States. And so, citizenship-wise, yes, it is bad because we do not want to legitimize Trump and his toxic narratives.
Here.
As such, now on SciGov, they also say how by the UK leaving, by Brexit, this will also somehow stop infighting within the EU. But the question is how? Do they actually answer how it's going to stop? Because even when the UK leaves, there's still other nations. It just means that it's just them fighting without the UK, without us able to go in and help, without us having a mouthpiece inside the EU. So it doesn't stop infighting. It stops a means for us to help stop infighting. So, and they call London a financial center. Well, yes, it was a financial center. However, if you look at financial reports after Brexit, you can see how London has, I don't want to say London has fallen, but however, the economic, in economic standpoint, yes, London is not as safe, as high and mighty as it was before, because now there's uncertainty, now that, now there is like uncertainty, and that isn't what economists actually will go for. They don't like uncertainty, which was why stock markets dropped, which was why you can even look after Trump was elected, stock markets dropped because of uncertainty, and you can see that with the EU. So calling London a current financial center, while yes, it was, is it going to be so in the future? And for all those reasons, we are proud to oppose.
Tonight I'd like to shed some light on my partner Amber's point about security and development. So today, and since 9/11, there's been a growing fear of terrorism globally and domestically here in the United States. And it's been shown time and time again throughout the European Union's history that they are very reluctant to have counterterrorism measures and pump funds into defense and security measures. And it's been shown as well that one of the only countries that are in the European Union, known as the United Kingdom, is the only one that's actually providing the funds and necessary resources to obtain this global counterterrorism operation that the United States is looking to deal with in terms of the European Union. The European Union's inability to compromise without the United Kingdom is very apparent, and it's been seen time and time again as we see now that countries like Germany, countries like Italy and Spain are now cutting down their defense, demilitarization, and limited funding to counterterrorism programs are creating an even greater discourse between the European Union and the United States. And now when we have Brexit and the United Kingdom is now separated itself from the European Union, it opens up more opportunity for the two countries to have a partnership and become more exclusive in that partnership as they were before under the European Union. And in this partnership, they will be able to enhance their security, counterterrorism, and critical infrastructure efforts. And because the United Kingdom has such a similar political structure to the United States, they oftentimes, in terms of security and counterterrorism, have the same agenda. And because of that, they're able to act and coordinate in a similar fashion. In essence, these two countries validate one another. Because they are so similar and like in structure and action, if one does one action toward counterterrorism or to prevent counterterrorism, the other will follow for the simple fact that it's okay that the other one is doing so.
Point of information.
Why couldn't the US and the UK coordinate on counter-terrorism while the UK was still part of Europe?
So that's a very good question. As I was trying to explain before, when the UK was part of the European Union, the United Kingdom was the only country within the EU that was providing substantial funds to enhance these counterterrorism procedures, where the rest of the other 27 countries within the EU were not willing to negotiate and not willing to put money toward those defenses. So, since the UK's been in the EU, and even now we today see the UK's willingness to protect and look out for US interests in terms of security and counterterrorism, which provides a great benefit to the United States, because now, even though the United Kingdom is outside of the EU, there's an established partnership, there's an ally in terms of United States interests with foreign policy that involves terrorism. Where it was prior to this, when the United Kingdom was in the EU, it was more difficult to get to establish a unified program within the EU and the United States alike. Another opportunity that's posed for the UK as an independent nation outside of the EU, when it involves itself with the United States in terms of counterterrorism measures, there's now a large intelligence sharing group that collects data and information that's used interchangeably and is passed around through these specific countries. It involves the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. And this is so critical and important in terms of security and counterterrorism measures globally, because it is this specific sharing group is one of a kind, and there's not many like it, which involves Western European powers and the United States with intelligence collection. So essentially, the United Kingdom's absence from the EU is going to increase the stability of American security programs, as well as the UK, because they have an established agreement that they want to put more funding toward military and toward other counterterrorism measures. And this will now leave the European Union free of any obligation to appease the United Kingdom and go and trying to attempt a counterterrorism measure that they're okay with doing outside of United States interests. So ultimately what we're doing is the European Union is now allowed to be left to their own devices and create a counterterrorism program in which it's to their liking. They don't have to run it by the United Kingdom, and they don't have to run it by the United States. They can run separately and be more organized and cohesive there. Also, this provides, I already stated it as well, in addition to benefiting the United States in terms of counterterrorism measures, is also going to create a more streamlined process for the UK as well. It's going to provide a benefit to the UK because they're trying to mimic the same counterterrorism measures as the United States. So ultimately, Brexit is a win-win situation for the United States and for the United Kingdom. And for all those reasons alone, Brexit is...
Point of interest? Okay. Okay, so we talk a lot about the defensive benefits. How about economic for our citizens, politically? What about those?
So in terms of counterterrorism, when you're left with a country that is now vulnerable to global terrorism, once a terrorist action hits, you don't have an economy, you don't have a government, because that is now decimated by this terrorist action, which is so important, so critical at this time to put money in defense systems, in counterterrorism programs. That way we can maintain and protect our critical infrastructure. That way, we are able to maintain our political government and able to uphold our economic stability and be the superpower that we want to be within this within the global world. So for all those reasons, again, the United States is essentially benefiting from Brexit.
Prime Minister Theresa May said Brexit is Brexit. But it's so much more than that, and it's so much more in terms of the US. What we really want to discuss here, what I'll discuss in my speech, is why this is important in the US outside of sort of like policy issues and what they're talking about on side government, because it also affects people, but also to strengthen the arguments that my partner previously made. So what I'll be talking about is we tell you about the economic downside of Brexit to the US, why this is true and also why it is important. Then we will tell you about the issues of security and power and legitimacy within the government, which they also touch on. And I will weave my rebuttal through this. So first, I want to tell you about why we think it's important to look at how this affects people within the US. So we tell you about how there are government impacts, right? The economy is a huge thing, and issues of like stock market are also important in terms of government, but we want to tell you why that's important to people, because we think that the welfare of people is the most important obligation of the government, and therefore a very important part of this conversation and necessarily needs to be addressed outside of issues like terrorism. And then also, we are going to talk about the issue of legitimacy and security in this way, and tell you about how we actually lose out on security and power within the global sphere. And then we'll also tell you about why a lot of their arguments don't necessarily matter, even if they're true. So, first, we want to tell you that my partner expands a lot on the economics of what happens with Brexit. But let me clarify some things, right? What you don't necessarily already know is that the UK is the #7 trading partner with the US. Why is this important? First, we see the economy of the UK goes down through Brexit. We lose a lot of the exports that we get into the UK, and if you didn't know, the exports are the reason why, a large reason for why we get out of the recession, and a lot of economists believe that we will go back into the recession given if the UK falls down in this way. We also see what my partner tells you about the pound and the euro. When they go down, we go up. But what is the problem with the US dollar being strong in comparison is that a lot of our stock market also exists in London, as they like to tell you, right, on side government. But the problem with this is that now the businesses within the US have low stocks, but how does this also affect people, right? So what we want to tell you is we told you that the Federal Reserve keeps interest rates low, and we also tell you that the stock market is weak. What is the problem with this? First, you see that things like your 401k retirement plans now have less money in them. That's really important for people in the United States. You also see that investments are down, and now you've lost a lot of money. We also tell you that you have a lot of job loss, as we told you about how they lose money and then they fire people. So this is extremely important in the sphere of how this affects the citizenry and the people within the United States. So what do they tell you about this? They tell you about how it's a financial center, right? This is what opening government tells you. But what they don't tell you is that it's no longer going to be a financial center, because you actually see a lot of companies that are actually focused within London then move to other European countries, so they no longer have that power. Also negatively affects us if we're more attached to them, because you saw when they actually hit an all-time low after Brexit, we lost 50 points on the Dow. So then you actually see the very impactful negative impacts onto the government and of their people. And then onto what we talk about with legitimacy and security. But before that, your point.
So can you actually get to where you talk about the people? Because the entire beginning of your speech, 4 minutes, has been specifically about economics, where you said it was more than that.
Okay, so we already tell you that people have 401ks, which are people's retirement plans, that over 50% of America actually has. And then also, we have the issue of investments, whether it be 401k or straight up stock investments. You get a lot of people losing their retirement plans. They don't have money. And then you also see, as Mo already told you, a lot of job loss when big companies like Apple lose money in this sphere is that the UK is our main channel to dealing with Europe and dealing with them within the EU. Now you know that when you have Brexit, the UK alienates itself from pretty much the rest of Europe. And why is this bad for us? This means that we no longer have a way of negotiating the actual laws that they want to tell you that we can negotiate with the rest of Europe. Sure, we can maybe negotiate with the UK, but that doesn't do much for us. So we're dealing with issues like digitized privacy laws with the internet. This is a lot more than just the US and the UK. Trade is still important outside of the UK as well, and this is harder to deal with when we've already alienated ourselves. And the point that my partner tells you about how this gives legitimacy to Trump's government is what we're telling you is that the narratives that they seem to want to avoid about how Brexit is extremely anti-refugee, anti-immigrant, right? These legitimize Trump and also are then our only ally and alienate us from the rest of the global community as well as just generally being bad. So then, when they tell you about the issue of strengthening Europe and their integration, right? This is a problem because they still have infighting anyways. They don't tell you how that's really solved because other governments also have problems with policies within the EU. But also, what ends up happening is they just turn against the UK anyways, right? So you really still have infighting within Europe anyhow, and they don't solve for that. It doesn't become better, and we don't actually get a more unified Europe, and we don't get them more unified to work with the US, as we already told you. And then, so this makes all the things I already told you about, trade agreements, much harder. And then when they tell you about the issue of UK and US power, when I've already told you that they're no longer really a good ally for us, and then we tell you that you lose out on Europe, which honestly, of all the countries in Europe, compared to the UK, we think that this outweighs. And then what we also tell you is that when they talk about terrorism, we really want to acknowledge the issue with this argument being that first, the issue with them actually wanting to have the same policies against terrorism that we do is that this is already a bad narrative, right? This mainly has to do with the issue of refugees coming into countries and immigration. But we also think that then you don't actually get all of this stuff and they can still give intel even if they don't have this like proof because intel already existed. And for all of these reasons, we are proud to oppose.
So, what I'm going to bring you in today's debate is we're going to talk about the issue of economic interdependence and how because the EU was founded on this very principle, it is extremely difficult for any nation to actually be able to be seen in the proper light that they should be, as well as sort of the populism hangover that we've been currently having the past years following the wake of Brexit and the election of Trump. But before I get into that, I would like to respond to a few things from the previous speakers. So we hear out of Mo's speech and continue through his speech is that the United States is going to be harmed very badly economically because the UK is one of our biggest exporting partners. News, this is a fact. Exports from the United States to the UK are only 4%. The major portion of our exports go to either Canada or to Mexico due to the NAFTA agreement that we're in. Secondly, they don't actually explain how any of these financial institutions, corporations, or anything like that actually break down. They just use buzzwords like 401k and retirement plan because they know the audience that they're speaking to. This isn't actually proper argumentation. They don't develop the point at all. Nothing. So, second, we hear continued throughout, so both speeches were pretty much the same thing, even though Eve's spent 4 minutes saying that she wasn't going to give the same speech about economics like Mo. So we hear the politics argument that gets out very, very small, is that the UK is our main ally in the EU. Another fact, we have good relations with Germany. We have good relations with France. There are other avenues for us to gain better footing in the EU sphere. Nothing. So we have other avenues for us to gain footing in the EU sphere that are not strictly the UK. We think that this is not necessarily something that is standard or mandatory or something that we necessarily must do for us to actually negotiate. Our position in the global sphere doesn't actually change. So if the EU wants to cooperate with us, which they probably should because we would like to cooperate with them, it will happen. We don't need the UK for that to happen. Moving on, we also hear about like, oh yeah, actually that's pretty much it. So moving into like what we bring you today and sort of the populism hangover and economic interdependence and how that's like a very big problem. So I'll start with economic interdependence. So the EU's like founding principle following World War II is that the EU was formed to create sort of this like network or this mesh between all European nations where we would be like linked together, where they would be linked together economically, and due to them being linked together, there wouldn't be any more fighting. There's a very big problem with this, and that is now the sole welfare of each individual nation is the sole basis of what their monetary ability can be. We think that this is an extremely big problem in the founding of the EU because we think of the EU not as a European governing body, but as a sort of like treaty, a financial treaty between all these European nations. What it does not account for is situations where resource scarcity or crisis occur. It could, like, to give you the example, just recently, the Syrian refugee crisis, where we saw many European nations break away from the sort of like traditional EU mentality and not wanting to accept refugees because of like the financial strain. This only goes to show that within the EU and the mindset that the EU created is that of economic interdependence, is that your importance is only due to the amount of money that I am able to like either get from you or the amount of trade that we'll be able to do together. And that's very evident in the opening opposition speech. I'll take you in a minute. So we think that what happens is when relations begin to break down and when you have situations of crisis, you see that money becomes the main factor, not people, the same that we hear from opening opposition speech. So an example of this would be Greece. We see that when Greece was in financial crisis, although if you disagree with the way that they handled it, we don't think that austerity measures are in any case something that should be supported because it's just simply immoral and inhumane. But what many nations in the EU had called for was these austerity policies because at the sole basis of their founding, money was the most important thing. What we feel is that what this does is it fuels populist rhetoric that we heard from the Brexit vote and that we heard in the United States. We think that what we should do is that we should shift the focus from money being the foundation or the sole basis for geopolitics, which we could see through like the G20, like a small group of like nations that have like a large amount of global capital, and the IMF with is like a global organization that like influences monetary policy. We see that what we see in like the way that these international organizations work is that money is a sole factor. With the IMF, we see that there have been a whole host of problems with their ability to like grant specific or like suggest specific policies to smaller nations because they see that there's better reward if they screw over those small nations in favor of larger ones, which we see through this economic interdependence mentality. I'll take it, yeah.
So your opening argument says that it's better when Britain is in Europe because Britain helps America achieve its interests, but you say that we could just work with Germany anyway. Which of those arguments is true?
So it's not mutually exclusive. We can have a good relationship with the EU and still have a good relationship with Britain. We don't think that we have to have a one or the other type of situation. Now that leads us into sort of our populism like hangover. So in the past 2 years, we've seen like a sweep of like populism go over Europe and North America. We see many nations, especially during these specific like election cycles, have to decide, are they going to go with this like sort of like nefariously charismatic like a populist candidate or like more reasonable candidates? And what we see from like the wake of Brexit and from the wake of Brexit is that most nations in Europe followed suit in going to like a more center candidate rather than going down the road of like following the more populist candidate. The reason why this happened is because populism is an unsustainable ideology. Your side is the only valid side in populism, and everything that opposes it is everyone that opposes that ideology is an enemy of the state and of national ideas. It creates this idea of unipolarity within a nation where people only can support this one ideology or else they are seen as like some extremely problematic figure. We see that when you have a situation like this is a very big lead up to fascism, which is something that we believe that the EU was literally founded to counter against. What we think now is that when you have like inevitable fallout, this occurs because you don't have people that can actually check. We think that when you have the UK leaving the EU, we have this stronger idea of Atlanticism, which was gently touched upon in the opening government speech, and now we get a better sense of Atlanticism, where we have this sort of self-reflection between both nations, where we can self-check each other and not allow for this ideology to spread in both nations. Thank you.
Okay, so before I get into my speech, some rebuttal, firstly focusing on opening government, and secondly focusing on closing government. So firstly, opening government talk a lot about national security, and why the national security of the United States will be terribly affected, and the United States citizens will be less safe at the moment that Brexit happens. We simply don't believe that that's true. Firstly, because whilst the UK is leaving the European Union, it is not leaving NATO, it is not leaving Five Eyes. The MI6 will continue to cooperate with the NSA on important matters of security that involve the nations. Also, the one European agency that Britain says it probably won't leave is Europol, the cooperation between European police forces. So even if you think that terror attacks within Europe affect the US massively, like Britain will still be able to deal with those on a European level afterwards. Secondly, talking about CIDD. So 2 points. Firstly, they talk about why the European Union is only about money and why that's necessarily bad. Firstly, we don't think that it necessarily matters to America, particularly whether Germany screws over Greece economically. I'm not clear as to why that makes a difference to the average citizen. But also, like, they talk about sort of greater problems, and as I go on to prove later in my speech, Europe as a coherent bloc would be better able to deal with the problems that affect every European nation. Problems like not only the refugee crisis, but also global warming, and also the effects of mechanization in industry, also economic factors that affect every country equally. Then they talk about how, like, they try to claim that their policy about the United States having a relationship with the UK and the United States having a relationship with other European countries is somehow not mutually exclusive, right? We don't think that's necessarily true. Like, for instance, at the G8 summit that happened immediately after Brexit, the US president had a meeting with Angela Merkel and then President Francois Hollande of France, but didn't have a meeting with Theresa May, right? We think that at a certain point you have to prioritize dealing with some countries than others, both economically and politically. You spend more time talking to them. They also went on to talk about populism hangover, about how the effect of populism, which is so toxic within societies, the example of Brexit and the way Brexit has been constructed will then cause that to further go on in the future, right? We simply don't get why the average Trump voter in Ohio or Michigan or Alabama particularly cares about the standard of political discourse in Birmingham or Belfast or Barcelona or Berlin. We don't think that that necessarily makes a difference to the way they talk about politics with other people, and we don't think that necessarily legitimizes one political party or another. We think that American political issues are necessarily American, and that Brexit will have like barely any effect on that, and we don't see that they provide a mechanism why it will. So moving on to my constructive case, I will have two related points. The firstly is that the first is that Europe, the causes of fragmentation within Europe, the causes of nation states not cooperating with each other, are to a certain extent independent of Brexit and will take place anyway, and why that fragmentation within Europe will necessarily be bad for America, but also why a Europe that is less united and will be less able to deal with geopolitical problems that affect America and allow America to execute its larger geopolitical strategy. So firstly, the fragmentation of Europe. Yesterday, Angela Merkel won the German election, but won it in a way that makes her less powerful. She is not going to have the same coalition that she would have. She is not going to be able to lead Europe in the same way that she has done for the last 4 years, because she will be dealing with internal struggles at home, being in a coalition with Liberal and Green parties that necessarily disagree with each other. We think therefore that there will be a certain amount of a leadership vacuum within Europe. We also think that the differences between particularly Eastern European countries and Western European countries will continue to be apparent. This is not necessarily based on refugee policy. This is based on the fact that the Polish government was censured by the European Council for not adhering to standards with their judiciary. We think it's because the Hungarian government as well have been arresting journalists and putting people in prison and not adhering to the democratic standards that the European Union expects of its member countries. We think that those countries will therefore express opinions that are against the European consensus. We also see the rise of regional movements within Europe, within Scotland, but also Catalonia, which had an illegal independence referendum, I believe yesterday or possibly this week, and also within Italy, within other countries where there is internal problems within countries, right? We think this is bad for all of these individual nation states because they are less able to execute wider policies because they spend all their time trying to keep their country together or keep their, involved in disputes with other nation states. We think that the effect of Brexit is that there is the absence of the US as the most reliable and dependable partner within the European Union. We think that the United States will then be forced to rely on countries that are less willing to listen to the US's point of view and less able to carry the US's agenda on the European stage. And we think that's necessarily problematic, and that means that the US will not be able to get stuff done. We think that's even worse because the problems of Europe geopolitically are important to the United States. So the three big problems are dealing with an expansionist Russia on the eastern frontier, dealing with the flow of refugees from Syria, and dealing with the ongoing instability in North Africa. The policy of the United States over the last 5 to 10 years has been to count on a strong Europe leading involvement in these things. See the fact that France and Italy and the United Kingdom were involved in airstrikes in Libya, for example. This is good for the US in that it means that the US doesn't necessarily have to get involved in these disputes. It means that the US can sit back and let other countries do a lot of the heavy lifting, and that means they have to commit less resources. And that means that economically and politically, the US can move some of its capital towards dealing with newly emerging Asian economies and people in the developing world. They can develop links with China, links with countries in Southeast Asia. We think that that is how you get security. When you can count on Europe to deal with these long-term threats to you, when you can count on being able to get your policies through and get policies that are amenable to your interests in Europe, that means that the United States can that the citizens of the United States can feel like their government is able to combat ISIS, is able to combat Russia. We think if the United States can't combat Europe, it will find itself overstretched, it will find itself economically weak and less able to commit its goals, and it will be not able to deliver for its citizenry. Don't blame either of us. We voted for Remain. We don't think we think that Brexit will not be beneficial for literally anyone.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Michaela, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today why, kind of like you said, everything they said is not necessarily true. We think that Brexit has already happened, and what Hugo and I are going to tell you that it's not the doomsday that we've heard up and down the bench. It's been almost a year since it happened, and guess what? The world hasn't exploded yet. Now, the EU was founded off of this idea of economic interdependence, and Hugo talked to you a little bit about this. But economic interdependence was made in terms of, we're going to make trade easier, we're going to make travel cheaper, we're going to fight fascism. We, as the united economic entity of Europe and the countries that are part of the EU, are going to solve all of these problems. So we're going to lower tariffs, we're going to create a council, we're going to create courts, we're going to create an administration that's going to make decisions that are good for all of the EU. We're going to have a united front. And though this seemed like a really great course of action, and economic interdependence was seen as this is the solution to turmoil, flash forward to 2017, this isn't necessarily the case. as Hujon told you, economic interdependency is not the only form of relationship building. It's not the best form of relationship building, and it's a heck of a lot better than the form of relationship building that they're proposing. We think that when we move away from economic interdependency, which is what Brexit does, we can make better relationships, we can make more meaningful relationships, we can make more effective relationships, we can make more sustainable relationships, and we can finally, as individual and unique countries, become more introspective of ourselves and of retrospective of others. So why is Brexit good for the United States? Because it reshapes our conception and our approach to international relationships. Contemporarily, all we see citizens is as a desire or a means to the lowest common denominator. So individual countries and individual citizens within the EU are regarded only in terms of how they can be beneficial for the entirety of the economy of the EU. We hear them come up and say, well, why does it matter to citizens about austerity in Greece? Well, it matters to the citizens in Greece who austerity affects. But when the United Nations or the European Union makes a decision in terms of austerity is what you're doing, it doesn't necessarily regard the uniqueness of the individuals and the uniqueness of the citizens within Greece. It regards what's best for the entirety of the European Union. And we don't think this is the best way to make decisions, right? So the British weren't the British, but a means to financial prosperity, right? And this is where we're clashing with closing opposition. Because this idea that the only way that individuals and the only way that individual countries can function as a means to end works until it doesn't work. It works until there's not enough jobs, and until there's refugees coming in, until there's a lot of economic strain and people don't have money. We think it only works when the ability to make decisions then becomes impossible, because all of the decisions that are made for Britain and for the UK happen not in London, not in Britain, but in Brussels. And this is a problem with the idea that the only way we can build relationships, the only way that we can make decisions is through this greater web or this monolith idea of the European Union is going to decide based on the lowest common denominator. Yeah.
The refugee crisis, the economic crisis of the late 2010s, are all European problems. Why do you think that nation states, you can't deal with them on a European level and nation states would be better?
Because we think that even though they're European problems, the way that individual countries should deal with problems is based on how individual countries can deal with them. The way that the United States can deal with an issue is probably not the same way that Canada can, because we have different governmental structures, we have different citizens, we have different makeups in our economy. We think that it's ridiculous to think that, one, there can't be some sort of conglomeration of we both agree on these same things, but we're going to agree on them as individual countries. And this is what Brexit does. What we're proposing is we're not making decisions based on the lowest common denominator. Brussels isn't going to be the one making decisions, but instead, we're going to make decisions as Britain, and you're going to make decisions as Germany, and we think we might have the same goal, but we're going to approach it in a way that's best for our country. We think that this is how we build sustainable relationships, this is how we fight things like populism, and this is how we become more reflective and introspective, right? So Brexit has allowed the United States to form a relationship based on not finance, like we heard from the first half of this debate, but instead based on common ideals. Not based on the fact that maybe our structures of democracy are different, but in the end we both want democracy. Maybe the way we conceptualize rights are different, but we both want human rights. And we think that this has happened before. We think we get a stronger and happier international relationship when the EU isn't constantly a buffer to the interests or similar interests of two countries like the UK and America. Right? We think that relationships built on sovereignty, relationships that recognize autonomy, have historically been more successful, and they've happened before. We saw this with human rights. The entirety of the international community, individual countries said, hey, we think that people should have human rights. We think that genocides probably shouldn't happen. But I didn't say that because the rest of the EU said that. I didn't say that because the club said that. I said that because we as the United States believe that, and maybe the UK also believe that, and maybe a lot of other countries also believe that, and then we can come together as individual countries on a common stance. Instead of saying, the EU thinks this is what's best for its biggest players like Germany, so we're going to make this decision even if it's not good for smaller countries like Hungary or for Slovakia. Further, we think that recognizing the uniqueness of statehood, again where we're clashing with CO, is better because bilateral relationships are built off of similarities outside of finance. We think that what we heard from the first speakers on the opposition is doomsday is going to happen because of Brexit. It hasn't. The economies are still there. Economies are resilient. We're still trading. We can still trade with the rest of Europe and also still trade with the UK. But instead what happens is when we build relationships, or don't build relationships based off of ideals, what we get is a likeness in ideals. We act as a mirror to each other. And this is where we stop Trump and we begin to fight against populism, right? They say that the way we fight populism and think what's happening in Hungary is really bad, but that happens in the midst of the EU. What we're proposing to you is a different way to conceptualize relationship building. We're telling you, I can have a relationship with another individual country and still have a relationship with a separate individual country, and that's okay, because oftentimes we agree on common denominators. I can look at your country and criticize Brexit and say that's what populism looks like, and the UK can criticize populism, and Americans say, wow, Donald Trump probably shouldn't have been elected. But at some point, when we have these relationships, we're more likely to be introspective and look at it. Populism in the UK looks maybe a lot like populism in the United States, but we don't get that when the EU as an entire entity is constantly acting like a buffer. We think that we need to re-understand relationships with other countries. We think countries deserve autonomy, countries deserve sovereignty, and countries deserve to make decisions based on the uniqueness of their country and not what's good for the major players in a specific entity.
In order to win this debate, any of the teams have to prove that either the effects of Brexit are beneficial to the US or they're not. The reason we're talking about the impact on Europe is only important in the context of this debate insofar as it impacts things that the USA cares about and that is important to the USA. I think Richard stood up and gave an excellent speech talking about why cohesion in Europe gets even worse when Britain has already left the EU, and why that's so important for cross-border issues which Europe is less empowered to be able to deliver. I don't think there has been a sufficient response to that material from the opposite side. So 2 points of clash that I'm going to talk to you about today. First of all is the impact on Europe. Hint, we think it's really, really bad. Second point is the impact on the USA, and this is touching on the material that Richard brought to you about why what happens in Russia is important, why what happens in Syria is important, and how when Europe is less empowered and has a less cohesive voice to support the USA, that's a bad outcome for the USA. But first of all, I just want to respond directly to the points that we've just heard. So we had this idea that Brexit happened a year ago and nothing's really happened. The pedant in me would point out that we had the referendum a year ago, but the UK still hasn't left the EU. Things have gotten significantly worse since then, and there's a lack of common voice within Europe, that we're so obsessed with bickering internally that it's a lot more difficult to get things done. As Richard pointed out and wasn't responded to, other European leaders, no thank you, have seen the harms of prioritising international issues over their domestic voter base, just as has happened in the UK, such that countries like Germany, which would previously be championing initiatives that the USA supports, are much less empowered to do so. The other side claim that a united Europe will solve all problems, and that reduced interdependency means that individual countries can better achieve what they want to do. But they ignore the fact that some of these issues we're talking about, like refugees, are by definition cross-border, right? When they're moving from different countries and you need to have that dialogue about how that's managed. It's also not true that Brexit removes interdependencies between different countries, because even if we're not in the EU, the UK and the US will still trade to some extent. So I don't think side proposition have fulfilled their burden on that side. Yeah, so moving on to my 2 points of clash. So what is the impact on Europe? So proposition want to have their cake and eat it, right? They want to say that working with Europe is really, really important. Working with the UK is really, really important, and they can have both. But it ignores the way that the conversation has happened in the real world, in Europe and in the UK. So the fact is that the way that the referendum was held included a lot of oppositional narrative within the UK, and it's caused a lot of focus on issues domestically, internally, as opposed to prioritising these kind of international issues. The kind of headlines of what they seem to care about is kind of counter-terrorism and economics, right? But to some extent, there will be conversations, there will be intelligence sharing between the UK and the US, anyway, that don't think they fulfill their burden in explaining why Europe is a unique body that can only achieve this. Richard mentions NATO, Richard mentions MI5. We don't get that material responded to from the other side. Moreover, Richard builds on the excellent grounding that we had from our opening side and explains not only why the economics of Europe doesn't benefit from Brexit, but why those conversations are even harder because a lot of leaders in Europe are distracted, they're prioritising their own voter bases, and they're less willing to put themselves out there to support policies on the global sphere, like sanctions in relation to Russia, Syria, North Africa, other issues like that. So my second point of clash is talking about why this is really important to the USA. So in terms of economics, responding to proposition, they want to say that Britain will be better off and Europe will be better off, and that the US can continue to trade with them. That's an important part of this debate, but we think what we uniquely bring as closing opposition is the security angle and the safety angle of the borders of the USA, right? Because it's all very well having a prosperous economy, but if there's nobody there to enjoy it, we think that's quite clearly more fundamental and more important point in that debate. Yes.
So what we've heard so far from your speech is the only way that we can build effective relationships is through mass entities like the EU. So then how do countries build relationships when they're not part of the EU?
So
Does it ever happen?
So I challenge your claim that we're saying that the only way to build relationships is through Europe. We think that Europe is effective at helping cross-border communication for issues within Europe, but our case is that the absolute minefield of conversations and press that's happening about Brexit at the moment is completely dominating the bandwidth to talk about international issues. And domestic leaders, for example, within the UK, feel like they have to prove to their political voters that they're being tough on Brexit, that they're demanding as much as they can from Europe. And conversely, Germany and France feel like they have to be shown to be doing a tough job against Europe, to be demanding all they can from Britain. So like there's this huge infighting happening there, and there's not that focus on outward perspectives, and that's spreading throughout Europe, right? So when you had conversations about Brexit, as they're calling it, we're not saying that relationship building is a bad thing, but we think destroying relationships in a really harmful, toxic way and broadcasting that to the world shows that where countries like the UK and the US have similar values and they want to achieve those globally, we think that those security values, which are even more important than economic cohesion, we think that that gets a lot harder. So very proud to propose. Thank you so much for having us. What a fantastic debate.
All right, so traditionally we usually say thanks to the debaters. Now across the aisle, shake hands, congratulate each other. First debate of the tour, 2017. All right, so now comes the part where you've been patiently listening for like an hour, and you're probably like have a million things you've been dying to say the whole time. You can raise your hand, I'll call on you, you can speak directly to them, or if you're not sure where the question should go, or maybe you just want to make a general comment about the debate, you can just direct it at me and I'll pitch it to somebody, or maybe I'll respond. It's very casual. So. I'm not going to Sean Spicer you.
I thought that was a wonderful debate, and I'm just curious as to whether any one of you happens to believe otherwise from the point of view that you took.
Passionate.
You're passionate.
We didn't get to pick our position.
Yeah.
No, of course not. But
I found out during class today, and I was like, okay.
so is there any on that side who feels otherwise?
No, I'm very happy here.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. It's like in the U.S. we sort of accept this idea that people will be divided from the positions they would naturally take. There's a huge debate about this among debate instructors in the 1950s, because the national topic was something like the United States government should recognize the Chinese government. And so some college instructors, like, it's immoral to force my students to defend recognizing a communist government as legitimate. We're not participating. This was a huge experience in the 50s. You read about debate historians talk about this thing. So we take it for granted that there was a huge like watershed fight about this among college instructors. Kind of a funny thing. But now we are like, okay.
So what was the, I was paying attention, but like, what was the debate question again?
Is this a night? The student here has been in the debate society for less than a month. Is like kindly sort of saying, did people sort of maybe get away from the central question?
Yeah, that's.
What do you guys think about that?
I mean, so basically, you guys were talking a lot about the EU and like how Brexit leaving it is bad or it's good, but you weren't really talking about how it affected the United States, really. I know the closing opposition did like talk about that like near the end, but like not many other people did. So yeah.
No, it's a good comment. Anybody want to say anything?
I feel like they were talking about it, just kind of got clouded in the EU. Like they didn't draw like the direct line between like what happens in the EU affects America, but I feel like they were being.
It's a hard thing to do because like we always get sort of, there's all these facts, all this information to deal with. Very hard things to keep it on track. But, yes, sir.
For our visitors from the UK, did you think maybe you had an advantage in knowing the issues more closely than our US residents?
I think, like, certainly we'd probably be more familiar with how it plays out in the UK, but in terms of the detail of US policy interests, I certainly think you guys had the advantage on that. And in a way, the debate could have played out differently, such that there was less focus on how it plays out at home. I guess it sort of developed in a fortunate way for us, yeah.
Okay. In the back there?
And conversely, for the American debaters, did you feel like you were previously well informed on Brexit and especially its relation to the U.S. policy?
Something that I found was there was a lot of research like available. We had like a really good library database that I used obsessively, but there was so much information. Like you type in Brexit and it's like, but it's all focused on Europe. There wasn't like a ton about like Brexit in America, or at least like a lot of things beyond like headlines and like catchphrases about like the actual impact. So I just thought that was frustrating. Beyond like, oh, okay, well America originally didn't support it, but okay, it happened. What ways can we work forward? Like, what does this realistically look like when that exit does happen?
Can I ask what sources you guys typically use for your information, and is there any point in British Parliament debate where you have to cite your sources during the middle of the debate?
Go ahead. So I like using, or like we all usually frequent like Al Jazeera or like New York Times has like The Atlantic, like Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Council on Foreign Relations is really good. They have like really good briefs on a lot of
Typically more
topics.
objective, not biased.
I mean, I don't think the Council on Foreign Relations is biased.
Al Jazeera?
Can I, sorry, just pitch in?
Of course, yeah.
So, in terms of sources, the format we're used to, that we do at competitions in Europe and the World Championships and the European Championships, you get the topic 15 minutes in advance, and you're not allowed any electronic resources. So some debaters will carry around sort of a big LibreArch file of material, but other than that, you don't have to cite your sources, and to a certain extent, you don't even have to say things that are actually true. A certain debater from my university 3 years ago, who was very proficient, used to occasionally in a debate make up the name of the president of a random African country. And use it as an example if they didn't know it.
I think they're building on that. I think it's quite rare that you win or lose a case based on a specific fact. And I think being aware of dynamics in things like international relations or if countries trade together a lot or a little, I honestly think that's a level of detail that can be really important for a debate so that you sound well informed. But I think if someone came up with a specific fact, there's certainly ways that you could build your argument to respond to that by talking about why, say somebody knows like the exact detail of like what the distribution of trade is between the UK and the USA is. You could just respond that like trade isn't the most important thing in the debate because reason X. So it's certainly a product of the style that we use a lot, not being very research focused, but I think there can be a bit of a risk that people see their cases as like being won or lost based on a fact, whereas I think it's more about the strategy behind it. And I think you should always ask yourself when you start a debate, what do we need to prove to win this debate? And then like build your facts on top of that. Whereas there's a risk if like, and I've like totally done it myself before, if you have like a really snazzy fact that you want to use, you might like artificially build an argument around that when actually it's not like the debate winning argument.
I wondered how you felt, Richard, about the potential border between, in Ireland. That seems to be a nasty issue.
So the problem with the border is that there is no actual solution.
Indeed.
In that I suspect most of the people who voted for Brexit think that you can just have checks on the border and that will be fine. Whereas there are very many reasons why that won't be fine. Like, for instance, that they might get blown up. I'm being glib, but there would have to be a massive security apparatus around each and every one, and there's 200 of them. But then you can't control immigration or have customs duties unless you have border posts. So the official UK line and the official Irish line and the official European line is that they all want it to be okay, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be okay. One of the failings I think of the British government in this process is that they haven't engaged with the Irish government closely enough. But yeah.
Or maybe too much.
Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. You focused on the economic and the refugee issues. My friends that are in the UK that voted against Brexit were really, and they're mainly architectural historians, art historians, and they're very concerned about the culture, the money's being cut off towards the cultural institutions in the UK. How does that translate to the United States? Does it?
I think that's a really I think that's a really good question. If I'm being totally honest, taking my hat off of being in a debate, I'm not convinced personally that there is like a huge causal relationship. It feels to me like that is one of those things that's determined by internal domestic politics. So if it's arts funding particularly, then I would expect there will be dynamics specific to the US that will drive whether that's a priority or not, separate to the UK. But I think it's certainly an important issue for us. And there are other issues such as funding that comes from Europe will often be sent to like deprived areas or areas that qualify for that. And there are cases like often like Wales is quite a low income area and stuff like that. And that dynamic is really interesting. But thinking about how that translates to the USA, I don't see a huge causal link to that. But I don't know if you guys have any share that view or any different opinions.
I definitely think I share that view, and I think that when you remove it from like the grand scheme of like macroeconomics and like we talked a lot about like relationship and international relationship building, really look at like the specificities of like funding and where it's going and like specific programs. In the UK, I feel very similarly. I'm not sure. I'm sure there could be an effect. I'm not really sure what it would be or how large it would be, but I'm on agreement with you.
I think you could maybe, if I was on the other side of the debate, talk about why that would be an impetus for if the British academic sector suffered very badly with the lack of research funding, why that would necessarily be good for the United States, because people would have to move, and especially if they were English speaking or whatever, they would find a natural place to go in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, from the university point of view, there's a lot of concern about this. But it looks like, due to the rise of nativist rhetoric in this country, the Canadians are the ones who are going to benefit the most, with the foreign students and the research money going to Canadian universities rather than here. Regardless of whether the actual visa policy changes for particular people, there's a chilling effect here.
Yeah, and I guess it's still like TBC to what extent there will be bilateral agreements.
Yeah.
So I know like science funding, I think there's been a few things agreed.
Yeah, it's all sort of playing out incredibly slowly. You know, people are like, how do we, what do we, you're just writing brand new law.
Yeah.
So it's kind of slow, but interesting. It's really, the cultural and the education sections of the debate are really interesting to me, so, personally. So, anyone else want to make a comment? Say anything? All right, well then, I guess, unless Carol wants to come up and, did you want to? Oh yeah, go ahead.
How bad is the taxing of the economies of the European countries with the influx of the different refugees flooding into Western Europe?
Can you repeat the start of that, please?
How taxing is it for the European countries with the influx of the refugees that are coming over, that are coming in, collecting welfare and things like that?
I guess the answer is like it depends. So for the UK, I guess like different countries will have kind of a different makeup of refugees coming in, so the issues will vary slightly. So for the UK, there's been a large number of refugees from Eastern Europe, and there's been pros and cons for that depending on what position in society you are. So some people would say that a lot of people coming from Eastern Europe take jobs up, and they, the pro of that is like, they're contributing to the economy, but the con of that is some people feel like jobs are going to people in Eastern Europe that they would, prefer to have themselves as UK citizens. But for example, we have a nationalised health service. A lot of refugees or international people contribute to that health service and help provide that. So there's kind of benefits there. There was a study done recently that was looking at the economic impact, only in the UK, of immigration. They said it was overall a net positive impact, but kind of only slightly. But I guess it's complicated because it's not just about economics. And I think what motivated a lot of people to vote in favour of Brexit was less about, the technical outcome of an economic survey and more about that feeling and a feeling of prioritisation in the country about who gets what resources. And, there's talk about schools having a lot of students there and people being worried that their kids aren't getting enough attention from teachers, and depending on what part of the country you live in as well, the situation's quite different.
It's also,
well, very similar to here.
It's also worth noting that firstly, it depends on what the proportion of refugees taken as the population of the country. So I think Sweden has the most refugees as a percentage of their population. But it also depends on what ethnic minorities already exist in those countries. So for instance, Germany already had a sizable Turkish population before the Syrian refugee crisis. So these problems were sort of nascent and ongoing. I think the other thing to note as well is that when you look at votes, particularly in the UK with the Brexit referendum, it mapped almost perfectly, and yesterday in the German election, the votes for Brexit, the votes for far-right parties, all happened in the districts with the least immigration and the least amount of refugees, and the most diverse parts of London were the parts with the highest Remain percentage, which is interesting.
And it may be worth adding to that for those of us, I also voted to stay in the EU, as I've only recently moved here from the UK myself, that a lot of people campaigning for Brexit confuse the issue of refugees and immigration. And actually the refugee stance of every country in the EU is not governed by the EU. So Sweden has taken a huge number of refugees by choice, and so has Germany, whereas the UK has taken very few in comparison.
That's a really good distinction.
That's true.
Yeah. Anyone else want to add anything? All right, well, if Carol wants to say anything, that would conclude the evening. Well, thank you guys for your sustained attention. Thanks to the debaters once again.
Well, I just have one comment. Our British debaters will be doing some school visits tomorrow. And I just ask that you do not tell the students about making up evidence. That actually happened 2 years ago when your college colleagues came and they suggested that happened and the teachers cringed, so please keep that quiet.
No, I mean, from an educational point of view, it's interesting because I think debate is sort of lagging behind kind of the crisis that we face. So this is a great book I'd recommend. There's two great books I'd recommend to anybody interested in this information crisis. One is called Organizing Enlightenment, and I forget the name of the author, but it's out of Johns Hopkins University Press. And the other one is a book that was a New York Times bestseller by a guy named Gleek, and it was called Information, A History, a Theory, a Flood. And the idea of debate is a little bit antiquated because we think of debate as a way of being like, well, here's how you determine between a fact and how you use a fact and how you find the facts to persuade. But now it seems like we're in a world where we have facts just sort of overwhelming us, like factual tsunamis. We just have information, information, information. And there's a global crisis, in a sense, of how do we teach students how to live in a world of overwhelming information. The Organizing Enlightenment book is funny because it's like we've been here before, and that was when books became inexpensive to print in Europe. You could no longer have the subject of knowledge, the man of letters. You could no longer have a Dr. Johnson. You could no longer have someone like Kant, who would teach surgery one semester and poetry the next, simply because he had read all 17 books on surgery that had been published in the world. Because making a book was incredibly expensive and difficult. When you have the explosion of cheap paper and printing press materials, which I won't bore you with the technology from that, but then you have it like, how do we know someone's knowledgeable? You can't possibly have read all the books. We're kind of in a similar, you can't possibly have read all the data, like what Amber's talking about, that all these different, everyone has different sources, and like there's so much stuff. Debate is a wonderful way of teaching people how to negotiate a world of surplus information. So, I mean, the idea that you have to make up the name of an African king or something is definitely an heuristic, competitive move for people who are highly sportified. That's not the heart of debate. That's not what debate is about. Debate is about teaching people how to negotiate a world of surplus information. And the solution that they came up with, spoiler alert for the book, should I spoil it?
No.
So the spoiler for Organizing Enlightenment is the Germans solved the problem by inventing the Ph.D. We'll teach you how to write a book on this to prove your expertise. But now we're sort of facing a world where the Ph.D. is sort of eroding in its value. Right? Think about the value of an undergraduate degree 20 years ago today. It's just slowly kind of creeping up on us. Now we're in another sort of information panic. So history repeats itself. So
from a PhD.
From a PhD. I mean, you know, it's like, I haven't really known, I mean, my PhD's in rhetoric, so it's kind of like, oh yeah, you're an expert in BS, so it's like, you appreciate when other people can challenge your expertise, right? And I kind of do. But it's a much more interesting thing with things like foreign policy. There's a book that came out, it's not a very good book, but I can't remember the guy's name, but it speaks to this. It's something like, I'll remember it in a minute. I just don't remember because it's not very good. But there's a really good book by Andy Merrifield, who's a British author, repping the ESU, I guess, but it's called The Amateur. And he's making the argument that it's not a question of expert versus non-expert, but expert alongside the amateur, the passionate amateur. And he uses the example of Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses, right? Very apt for the same. So Robert Moses was the urban expert who was making choices based on a set of data that was true for him because of his training. And Jane Jacobs had no formal training. And actually a lot of Jane Jacobs' ideas are very highly criticized. But some of her ideas about what constitutes a city were amateurish, and Robert Moses rejected them, but people could see that even though it was not in the articulated rhetoric of the expert. So I like the Merrifield approach. I don't like I think it's Tom Nichols. He's like a contributor to like foreign policy. Wrote a book about like expert under assault or something. It's like one of these books that you write in 2 months that sells a lot at the airport. Not very scholarly. I'm just all on video, sorry.